everyone, it's Shannon here. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, we're going to have some fun with Waffle Flower's new stencils. We're going to use the stencils to create an embossed panel and then add watercolor to create a bold and vibrant background. We're going to start out with the Inky stripe stencil. Here's the stencil here. It's a really beautiful stencil that has these stripes and they are a little irregular, almost look like they were painted with a paintbrush. I'm going to place the stencil over an A2 panel of watercolor paper. Once I get that stencil centered, I'll then grab a couple pieces of painter's tape, put it on either side to hold it down. Then I'm going to grab my VersaMark ink pad and I'm going to press the ink pad directly onto the stencil, onto the paper to release that ink and get it in all of those negative spaces or those open spaces in the stencil. Now I'm going to remove the stencil, grab some gold embossing powder, then I'll carefully pick up my watercolor panel. I don't want to get any of that VersaMark ink anywhere I don't want it by touching the ink with my fingers, and then I'll dip it into the gold embossing powder. Once I get that panel covered, then I will heat set it with my heat gun. Since I'm heat embossing on watercolor paper and watercolor paper is bumpy, my embossing is not as smooth and as even as I'd like it to look. So I'm actually going to heat emboss it a second time. I'm just going to grab my stencil, place it right on top, just line it up again. It's very easy to do. Then I'll grab my VersaMark pad, just like I did before, press it all over the panel, then dip it into some gold embossing powder, and then heat set just like I did before. And this second coating is actually going to make it a lot smoother and just have a more creamy finish and just, I think, look really pretty. So now that my heat embossing is done, I'm now ready to move on to my watercolors. Now you can use whatever watercolor medium you prefer, but I'm going to use my Tombow Dual Brush Pens. I just think they're very intense color and I really like that. The colors I'm using are on screen so you can follow along. So this is 025, a really pretty yellow. Then I'll move on to a pink and I'm just kind of doing it next to the yellow. Not really a strict reasoning here, just kind of getting some of that color evenly down onto the panel. Then I'll move on to this really pretty kind of aqua color. Get that down, and I'm kind of trying to sandwich the yellow here because my next color, this really dark blue, I don't really want it to get it too close to any of the yellow, and I'm going to be a little less heavy-handed with that, put a little less of that just because it's so dark and intense and it'll eat up my lighter colors pretty good. So now that I've got that color down, I'm going to give my panel a few sprays to get that ink kind of moving and flowing and starting to mix, and then I'll grab my brush here and I'll move that paint around or that color around a little bit more if there's any white areas and it's not quite going in and filling those in. And I'll also use it to pick up some of the paint where I feel like it's getting a little too mixed. Here I've actually switched over to a little paper towel to kind of pick it up in that center area where it's just getting a little mixed and kind of turning brown. I'll set that aside now to dry, and while that's dry I'm going to move on to my sentiment. For my sentiment, I'm using the Big Dots Sentiment Stamp Set, and I am going to stamp it on some black cardstock, little scrap here. I've centered my sentiment. I'm going to put down some anti-static powder, then ink up my sentiment in VersaMark ink, and then I'm going to dip it into my gold embossing powder again. Once I've tapped off the excess, I'll then heat set it with my heat tool, and then I will trim my sentiment down to a strip. Now that my sentiment is trimmed and my panel is dry, I'm going to do a little cleanup here. You can see I have some water spots still on the heat embossed areas on that gold because that water's not going to dry there. So I am taking a paper towel here and carefully kind of picking up the kind of water and the little bit of ink, kind of cleaning that up, and then I will dry it a little bit more on the back just because I'm impatient. I could just let it air dry completely, but I'm a little impatient, so I just dried it a little bit. You do want to be careful if you're using your heat tool to dry because you don't want to start to melt your embossing powder again. That's kind of why I went to the back with it. So I've trimmed my panel down 1/4 of an inch on all the sides, so it's a little bit smaller. Now I'm going to add some glue to the back side, and then I'll center it here on the front of an A2 top folding black card base. Because I trimmed it, it'll have this nice little black border, which I think will really clean it up and make it look really fancy. And once I finished sticking that down, I'll then grab my sentiment. I've already added some foam adhesive to the back side. I'll just center it here and stick it down, and that will actually complete my card. And I'll hold it to the cameras and get a good look at this finished card. I really love how it turned out. I love how bold and and vibrant the colors are, and the contrast of that gold heat embossing I think is so pretty. Here's a second card I created with the same technique. I used the paint stroke stencils for this card and also used a sentiment from the Big Dot sentiment stamp set. I hope you guys enjoyed today's cards and video. If you'd like any more information on the products I use, please check out the links below in the description. And if you like this video, I'd so appreciate it if you left me a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.